At 1800 hours on May 24th, 1944, Private Norman Campbell of the Cameronians crouched in a flooded trench at Blackpool Stronghold and watched Japanese infantry mass for another assault. The barbed wire was 30 meters away. Bodies hung on it from previous attacks. The monsoon rain had turned the defensive position into a swamp. Campbell had been at Blackpool for 17 days. He had eaten one meal per day. He had not slept more than 2 hours consecutively since arrival. The Japanese had brought up artillery. They shelled the position continuously. They attacked twice daily, at dawn and dusk. They had penetrated the perimeter that morning. Hand-to-hand fighting drove them out, but they would come again. The stronghold was dying. Medical supplies had run out 3 days earlier. The airstrip was under artillery fire and unusable. Casualties lay in flooded trenches because the aid station was overflowing. 19 men were so badly wounded that they could not be moved. When the order came to evacuate, the medical orderlies would shoot them. This was doctrine. Wounded who could not walk could not be evacuated. The Japanese did not take prisoners. Death by bullet was preferable to death by torture. Brigadier John Masters commanded 111th Brigade at Blackpool, approximately 2,000 men. They had established the stronghold on May 7th, expecting reinforcement within days. Reinforcement never came. The monsoon broke on May 15th. Movement through jungle became impossible. Other Chindit brigades that were supposed to support Masters were pinned down by Japanese attacks elsewhere. Blackpool was alone. Masters knew the position was untenable. He requested permission to evacuate on May 20th. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding American-Chinese forces in northern Burma, refused. Blackpool blocked the railway and road supplying Japanese forces at Mogong. Abandoning it would allow Japanese reinforcements to move north. Blackpool would hold until relieved or destroyed. The story begins 21 months earlier. In March 1942, when Lieutenant Colonel Orde Wingate arrived in Burma with orders to organize guerrilla warfare against the Japanese occupation. Wingate was 40 years old. He was eccentric. He wore a pith helmet and carried an alarm clock on a string around his neck. He ate raw onions. He read the Bible extensively and quoted it in operational orders. He believed that conventional military thinking was obsolete and that small, highly mobile forces, supplied by air, could achieve strategic effects that divisions could not. He had credentials. In Ethiopia in 1941, he had organized guerrilla forces that captured over 15,000 Italian prisoners with minimal British casualties. In Palestine in 1938, he had led special night squads that suppressed Arab insurgents through aggressive patrolling. He understood irregular warfare. He understood that mobility and surprise could compensate for numerical inferiority. He believed he could apply these principles in Burma. The strategic situation in Burma was catastrophic. The Japanese had invaded on January 15, 1942. By March, they controlled Rangoon. By May, they had pushed British and Indian forces out of Burma entirely. The British retreat covered over 1,000 miles through jungle and mountains. Casualties exceeded 30,000, most from disease and exhaustion. The Japanese had demonstrated tactical superiority in jungle warfare. British commanders concluded that Japanese soldiers were natural jungle fighters whom British and Indian troops could not defeat. Wingate rejected this conclusion. He argued that the Japanese succeeded because they infiltrated through jungle while British forces stayed on roads. The solution was to train British and Indian troops to operate in jungle better than the Japanese. Small columns moving independently, supplied entirely by air, could penetrate Japanese lines, destroy supply routes, and prove that Allied forces could beat the Japanese at their own tactics. General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief India, authorized Wingate to test his theory. In July 1942, Wingate received command of 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. The brigade was not elite. It consisted of regular infantry battalions assigned to India for garrison duties. Total strength was 3,000 men drawn from the King's Regiment Liverpool, the 13th Battalion King's Regiment, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, and the 2nd Battalion Burma Rifles. Average age was 24. Most had never seen combat. Wingate implemented training that veterans later described as the most brutal they experienced. Physical conditioning consisted of forced marches carrying 40-kilogram packs over distances exceeding 40 kilometers. Navigation training occurred in jungle at night without compasses. Survival training taught soldiers to obtain food and water from terrain. Weapons training emphasized ambush and rapid disengagement. Medical training taught every soldier basic first aid because casualties could not be evacuated. The training lasted 6 months. By January 1943, the brigade had been reorganized into 8 columns of approximately 400 men each. Each column was self-sufficient. It had its own platoons of infantry, mortars, machine guns, and engineers. It had mules to carry equipment. It had radio operators trained to coordinate air supply drops. It had RAF liaison officers who could call strikes. The columns would operate independently, marching separately but concentrating for specific missions. If attacked by superior forces, they would disperse and reassemble later at predetermined coordinates. Wavell originally planned a major offensive into Burma for early 1943. The Chindits would penetrate Japanese lines and attack supply routes, while conventional forces advanced from India. In December 1942, Wavell canceled the offensive. Logistics were inadequate. The Chinese forces that were supposed to attack from the north were not ready. The operation was postponed until 1944. Wingate argued that his force should operate regardless. His columns could strike Japanese supply lines, demonstrate Allied capability in jungle warfare, and provide intelligence on Japanese strength and positions. Wavell was skeptical but allowed the operation to proceed. On February 7, 1943, Wingate briefed his officers. The mission was called Operation Longcloth. The objective was the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway, the main Japanese supply route in northern Burma. The columns would march over 300 kilometers into Japanese territory, destroy sections of the railway, then return to India. At 1400 hours on February 14, 1943, the first columns crossed the Chindwin River from India into Japanese-occupied Burma. They used country boats and rafts. The river was 200 meters wide and flowing at 5 kilometers per hour. Crossing took 6 hours. Once across, the columns dispersed and marched east through jungle toward the railway. The Japanese detected the incursion within days. Radio intercepts indicated British forces had crossed the Chindwin. Reconnaissance patrols found tracks and abandoned campsites. But the Japanese could not locate the columns. They moved at night. They avoided roads. They left minimal trace. By February 23rd, lead elements had reached positions overlooking the railway. On March 2nd, No. 5, column commanded by Major Bernard Ferguson, destroyed a railway bridge at Bonchong Gorge. The demolition used 400 kilograms of plastic explosive placed beneath the bridge supports. The explosion at 300 hours was heard 15 kilometers away. The bridge collapsed into the gorge. Rail traffic stopped immediately. Engineers estimated repairs would take 3 weeks. Other columns attacked the railway at multiple locations over the following week. No. 3. Column commanded by Major Michael Calvert destroyed track at several points near Nankan. No. 7. Column destroyed a bridge near Kyaikthyn. The attacks forced the Japanese to deploy troops to guard the railway, diverting resources from the front, but the Japanese adapted quickly. They positioned patrols along the railway. They established ambushes at river crossings. They used motor vehicles on parallel roads to intercept supply drops and concentrate forces against detected columns. By mid-March, the Chindits were operating at extreme range for air supply. Water was scarce in the dry zone east of the Irrawaddy River. Japanese pressure was increasing. Wingate decided to cross the Irrawaddy and strike deeper into Burma before withdrawing. This decision was controversial. Crossing the Irrawaddy put the columns over 500 kilometers from India. Supply drops became unreliable because aircraft had to fly extreme distances. The eastern side of the Irrawaddy was dry terrain with limited water sources. The Japanese had more roads and better mobility there. Several column commanders argued for immediate withdrawal. Wingate overruled them. On March 10th, the columns began crossing the Irrawaddy. The river was 900 meters wide. Boats were requisitioned from villages, but there were not enough. Some men swam, some used rafts constructed from bamboo. The crossing took 3 days and was detected by Japanese observers. By March 13th, all columns were across, but the Japanese knew their approximate locations. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. No. 2 column was ambushed at Hintha on March 15th. The column commander, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander, ordered dispersal. The column broke into small groups that attempted to return to India independently. Approximately 260 of 1,000 men reached India. The rest were killed, captured, or died from disease and starvation. No. 8 column was surrounded at the Shweli River on March 29th. The column fought through the encirclement, but suffered heavy casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Scott ordered the wounded left behind with medical supplies and money. Villages were asked to care for them. In practice, village headmen turned most wounded over to the Japanese for reward. Wingate issued withdrawal orders on March 24th. The columns would disperse into small groups and return to India by whatever routes they could find. Radios would be destroyed. Mules would be released. Non-essential equipment would be abandoned. Each group would operate independently. Rendezvous points were established, but groups were not obligated to wait if Japanese forces were near. The withdrawal lasted 6 weeks. The columns fragmented into groups ranging from 5 to 50 men. They moved at night and hid during day. They avoided villages because villagers often reported their presence to Japanese patrols. They ate rice and whatever they could forage. Water sources were guarded by Japanese troops. Malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus were endemic. Men who became too sick to walk were left with small supplies in the hope that they might recover. Most did not. Crossing back over the Chindits was the most dangerous phase. The Japanese had patrols covering all crossing points. They had removed or destroyed boats. The river was too deep and fast to ford. Groups that attempted to cross were often ambushed. Lieutenant Alec Gibson of No. 3 Column was captured on April 4th while swimming the Irrawaddy. He spent 2 years in Rangoon jail. By late April, survivors began reaching India. Wingate's headquarters group arrived on April 15th. They had covered over 1,500 kilometers in 10 weeks. Other groups arrived throughout May and into autumn. Some men walked all the way to China before finding transportation back to India. The last stragglers reached Allied lines in October 1943. The cost was severe. Of 3,000 men who entered Burma, approximately 818 did not return. 450 were confirmed killed. The remainder were missing, captured, or died from disease during withdrawal. Of the 2,182 who returned, only 600 were fit for further service. The remainder were evacuated to hospitals suffering from malaria, dysentery, malnutrition, or combinations of all three. Many never returned to active duty. The damage to the railway was repaired within 2 weeks. The Japanese admitted later that Operations Longcloth disrupted their plans for offensive operations in early 1943 but did not force significant reallocation of resources. The strategic effect was minimal. The cost in trained manpower was high. Multiple officers filed reports criticizing Wingate's decision to cross the Irrawaddy and his failure to acknowledge subordinates' contributions in his after-action report. But the propaganda value was significant. British and Indian forces had operated deep in Japanese territory for 3 months. They had fought the Japanese and survived. They had destroyed targets and withdrawn successfully. The operation proved that Allied troops could match the Japanese in jungle warfare. This psychological impact mattered because British forces in 1943 suffered from perception of Japanese invincibility. Winston Churchill recognized this. In August 1943, he brought Wingate to the Quebec Conference where Allied leaders were planning future operations. Churchill introduced Wingate to President Franklin Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff. Wingate presented his long-range penetration concept and proposed a larger operation for 1944. The Americans were impressed. They offered to provide an air commando unit with fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, gliders, and light planes for casualty evacuation. The British committed 6 brigades totaling over 20,000 men. The second Chindit operation was designated Operation Thursday. It would launch in March 1944 with vastly expanded scope. Instead of raiding and withdrawing, the Chindits would establish fortified bases called strongholds deep in Japanese territory. The strongholds would have airstrips for supply and reinforcement. From these bases, mobile columns would conduct offensive operations against Japanese supply lines and communications. The strongholds would be defensible positions that could withstand Japanese counterattack while projecting power throughout the region. Training intensified through late 1943. The original 77th Brigade was reinforced by 111th Brigade, 14th Brigade, 16th Brigade, 23rd Brigade, and 3rd West African Brigade. Total strength exceeded 23,000. The training was similar to 1942 but more systematic. Soldiers learned to construct airstrips in jungle clearings. Engineers learned to build defensive positions quickly. Medical personnel learned to perform surgery under field conditions. The assumption was that casualties could be evacuated by air rather than left behind. On February 5th, 1944, 16th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Bernard Ferguson, marched into Burma from Lado. They would establish strongholds in the Indau area. The other brigades would fly in by glider and transport aircraft to landing zones designated Broadway, Piccadilly, and Chowringhe. At 1800 hours on March 5, 1944, aerial reconnaissance photographed Piccadilly landing zone. The photographs showed the zone blocked by logs. Either the Japanese had discovered the plan or local villagers had logged the area. 77th Brigade was scheduled to land there in 6 hours. Wingate believed the operation had been compromised and argued for cancellation. General William Slim, commanding 14th Army, authorized proceeding with modified plan. All gliders would land at Broadway. The glider assault began at 1812 hours on March 5th. 80 gliders lifted off from Lalagat airfield in India, towed by Douglas C-47 Dakota transport aircraft. Each glider carried 9 soldiers plus equipment. The flight distance was over 400 kilometers across mountains reaching 2,000 meters elevation. The gliders would release 5 kilometers from Broadway and glide silently to landing. The plan encountered immediate problems. Some tow ropes snapped. Some gliders released early due to turbulence. Some missed the landing zone in darkness. Broadway landing zone was smaller than aerial photographs suggested. It was rough terrain with ditches and stumps. The first gliders landed at 2130 hours. Several crashed on landing. Others collided with crashed gliders. Soldiers died in the crashes or were injured, but enough gliders landed intact to secure the zone. By dawn on March 6th, engineers were clearing debris and leveling the landing zone for transport aircraft. The 1st Dakota landed at 0900 hours. By evening, over 5,000 troops and equipment had flown into Broadway. The stronghold was established with defensive perimeter, airstrip, and communication center. Patrols moved out to secure the area. The Japanese had not detected the operation. Over the following days, additional brigades flew in. 14th Brigade established a stronghold at Aberdeen. 77th Brigade moved north from Broadway and established White City stronghold near Maulu, blocking the main railway and road to Mogong. The stronghold was named for the parachutes visible in surrounding trees after supply drops. White City became the tactical success of Operation Thursday. Brigadier Michael Calvert commanded 77th Brigade. The stronghold was positioned on high ground overlooking the railway. It had a double perimeter of barbed wire, anti-aircraft guns, artillery, and mortar positions. Air supply was consistent. The garrison strength was approximately 3,000. Japanese forces attacked repeatedly from March 16th through May 10th but never penetrated the defenses. Japanese casualties exceeded 1,500. Chindit casualties were approximately 300. On March 24th, Wingate died when his B-25 Mitchell bomber crashed in hills near Imphal. The aircraft was overloaded and flying in bad weather. All aboard were killed. Command passed to Brigadier Walter Lentaigne, who had led 111th Brigade. Lentaigne was conventional in thinking and less committed to Wingate's long-range penetration concept. He began modifying operations immediately. On May 10th, Lentaigne ordered White City abandoned and 77th Brigade to move north. On May 7th, 111th Brigade was ordered to establish Blackpool stronghold near Hopen to block supplies to Japanese forces at Mogong. The decision ignored key elements of Wingate's concept. Blackpool was too close to the Japanese front line. Japanese forces could concentrate against it quickly. The monsoon had started, making reinforcement difficult and the airstrip unusable in heavy rain. Masters established Blackpool on May 8th with approximately 2,000 men. The position was on low ground in a valley. The perimeter was incomplete when Japanese probes began on May 9th. By May 15th, the Japanese had brought up artillery. The 105th Regiment from the Japanese 53rd Division began systematic attacks. They shelled the position continuously. They attacked the wire at dawn and dusk. They infiltrated at night. On May 16th, Japanese troops penetrated the perimeter. Fighting was hand-to-hand. The penetration was contained but not eliminated. Japanese snipers fired into the stronghold from positions within the wire. Casualties mounted. The aid station overflowed. Medical supplies ran low. Morphine was exhausted by May 20th. Seriously wounded men lay in trenches because there was no space in the aid station. The airstrip came under artillery fire on May 18th. Supply drops became impossible. The garrison was running out of ammunition and food. Other Chindit brigades could not reinforce because the monsoon had made movement through jungle impossible. Calvert's 77th Brigade was engaged at Mogong. 14th Brigade was fighting west of the Irrawaddy. No relief was coming. Masters requested permission to evacuate on May 20th. Stilwell refused. On May 22nd, Masters repeated the request. Stilwell ordered Blackpool held. On May 24th, Japanese artillery increased intensity. Infantry attacks came from 3 directions simultaneously. The perimeter was contracting. The garrison was exhausted. Masters issued final warning. Either authorize evacuation or Blackpool would be overrun. At 1200 hours on May 25th, Stilwell authorized evacuation. The garrison would withdraw that night. Wounded who could walk would be carried. Wounded who could not walk would be shot. 19 men were in this category. The medical orderlies drew lots. Those selected performed the task. The men were shot and hidden in bamboo groves to prevent Japanese discovery. The evacuation began at 2000 hours. The rearguard held the perimeter while the main body moved out in single file. They moved west through jungle toward positions held by 14th Brigade. The Japanese pursued, but could not overtake them in the darkness. By dawn on May 26th, most of the garrison had reached safety. Approximately 100 men were killed during the withdrawal or died from wounds immediately after. Of the original 2,000, approximately 100 were fit for duty. The remainder required medical evacuation. On May 17th, General Slim had transferred operational control of the Chindits to Stilwell. Stilwell immediately began using them as conventional assault infantry. He ordered 77th Brigade to capture Mogong, a fortified town held by approximately 4,000 Japanese troops. Calvert protested. The Chindits were not equipped or trained for assault operations. They had no tanks or heavy artillery. They were already exhausted from months of operations. Stilwell was unmoved. Mogong blocked his advance. Capture it. The assault began on June 6th. Nonaon 44. 77th Brigade had approximately 2,000 men. They attacked fortified positions with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. The fighting was house to house. Japanese defenders fought from bunkers and prepared positions. Progress was measured in meters per day. Casualties were heavy. Captain Michael Almond and Rifleman Tulbahadur Pun earned Victoria Crosses for actions at Mogong. Both survived their actions, but Almond died from wounds 2 weeks later. Mogong fell on June 27th. The cost was approximately 1,000 casualties, 50% of the brigade. Of the remaining 1,000, fewer than 300 were fit for further combat. Calvert requested evacuation. Stilwell ordered the brigade to continue to Mietkina. Calvert refused. He shut down his radios and marched his men to Kameng, where they could be evacuated. His decision risked court-martial but saved what remained of his brigade. By July 1944, all Chindit brigades were exhausted. 16th Brigade had fought continuously since February. 111th Brigade was destroyed at Blackpool. 77th Brigade was destroyed at Mogayung. 14th Brigade and 3rd West African Brigade had sustained heavy casualties in scattered actions. 23rd Brigade had operated near Imphal and Kohima during the Japanese offensive there. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, ordered medical inspections of all Chindit units. The results were shocking. In 111th Brigade, only 100 men were fit for duty. The remainder were hospitalized. Average weight loss was 15 kilograms. Malaria infection rate exceeded 90%. Dysentery was universal. Scrub typhus, dengue fever, and tropical ulcers affected thousands. Medical officers described the condition as Chindit syndrome. Multiple concurrent diseases, any one of which required hospitalization. Evacuation began in late July and continued through August. The last Chindit left Burma on August 27, 1944. Total casualties for Operation Thursday were approximately 1,396 killed and 2,434 wounded. Over half the remaining personnel required hospitalization. Most could not digest solid food for weeks. Recovery took months. Some never fully recovered. The strategic assessment of the Chindit operations remains controversial. Supporters argue that the operations tied down significant Japanese forces and demonstrated that Allied troops could operate successfully in jungle. The Japanese admitted that the Chindit strongholds forced them to divert troops from frontline operations. The interdiction of supply routes complicated Japanese logistics at Imphal and Kohima. Critics argue that the casualties were disproportionate to results achieved. The railway damage was repaired quickly. The strongholds were eventually abandoned. The resources committed to Chindit operations could have provided Stilwell with an additional regular division that might have achieved better results with fewer casualties. The medical casualties from extended operations in monsoon conditions were predictable and preventable. The debate centers on whether Special Forces operations are cost-effective compared to conventional operations. Wingate believed that small, highly trained forces supplied by air could achieve strategic effects at lower cost than conventional forces. The Chindit operations tested this hypothesis under extreme conditions. The conclusion was ambiguous. The operations succeeded tactically at several points, but the cumulative human cost was severe. The human perspective is less ambiguous. The soldiers who served as Chindits described the experience as the worst sustained combat of World War II. They marched further, fought longer, and endured worse conditions than troops in any other theater. They lost more weight. They suffered higher disease rates. They received less rest. Many describe feeling abandoned after Wingate died, and Lentaigne changed the operational concept. The transition from mobile raiding to static defense and assault operations contradicted the training and doctrine they had prepared for. Ferguson wrote after the war that the Chindits proved British and Indian troops could fight the Japanese successfully in jungle. They demonstrated courage, endurance, and tactical skill. But he questioned whether the cost was justified. Over 3,000 died. Over 6,000 were wounded. Thousands more were medically evacuated and never returned to service. These were trained soldiers drawn from experienced battalions. Their loss weakened the divisions they came from. Calvert argued that the Chindit concept was sound, but was misapplied in 1944. The strongholds worked when positioned correctly like White City. They failed when positioned poorly like Blackpool. Using Chindits as assault infantry at Mogang ignored their training and capabilities. The decision to keep them in Burma during the monsoon caused unnecessary casualties. Under proper employment, the Chindits could have achieved their objectives with acceptable losses. Slim wrote that the Chindits' greatest contribution was psychological. After the disasters of 1942, British and Indian forces needed proof they could beat the Japanese. The Chindits provided that proof. The knowledge that Allied troops had penetrated deep into Burma and returned successfully changed attitudes. Troops who had considered the Japanese unbeatable learned otherwise. This confidence translated to improved performance in subsequent operations. The Japanese perspective was documented in post-war interrogations. Japanese commanders acknowledged that the Chindit operations forced them to maintain larger garrisons along supply routes. The railway interdiction complicated logistics but did not prevent offensive operations. The strongholds were annoying but not decisive. Japanese forces could have isolated and destroyed them if resources had been allocated. But resources were needed elsewhere, particularly at Imphal and Kohima, where the major offensive was failing. The aftermath was documented in medical reports. Hospitals in India received thousands of Chindit casualties in summer 1944. The patients arrived emaciated, feverish, and suffering from multiple infections. Treatment focused on nutrition, anti-malarial drugs, and treating infected wounds. Recovery was slow. Soldiers who had weighed 70 kilograms in March weighed 50 kilograms in August. Rebuilding muscle mass and treating chronic infections required months. Many were medically discharged as unfit for further service. The Chindits were officially disbanded in February 1945. The surviving personnel were reassigned to other units. The concept of long-range penetration was not continued. Conventional forces advanced into Burma in late 1944 and early 1945 without employing Chindit-style tactics. Japanese forces in Burma were defeated by May 1945 through conventional operations supported by overwhelming air superiority and logistics. The memorial to the Chindits stands in London near the Ministry of Defense. It consists of a stone pillar with a bronze chintha, the mythical Burmese lion that gave the Chindits their name. The memorial lists the units that served in the operations. It includes a quote from Wingate about the spirit and determination of the men. It does not provide casualty figures or discuss the controversy over strategic value. In Burma, now Myanmar, the battle sites remain largely unchanged. The jungle has reclaimed White City. Broadway and Blackpool, the railway that the Chindits attacked, still operates. The roads they blocked still connect northern Burma to the rest of the country. Villagers near former battle sites occasionally find artifacts, rusted weapons, ammunition, equipment. Human remains are found less frequently now, but discoveries still occur. Survivors of the Chindit operations lived with the experience for decades. Most did not discuss it extensively. When asked, they emphasized the physical hardships, the marching, the hunger, the disease. They described watching comrades die from wounds or illness. They described being left behind or leaving others behind because that was doctrine when someone could not keep up. They described the moment when they realized they might not survive. Few claimed the operations were worth the cost. Most believed they had accomplished what was asked of them under impossible conditions. They marched where ordered. They fought when required. They survived when possible. The strategic value was someone else's determination. They were soldiers following orders. The orders were to penetrate Japanese lines, establish strongholds, interdict supply routes, and defeat the enemy in jungle warfare. They did these things. The cost was approximately 1/3 of their force killed, wounded, or permanently disabled. The Chindit operations demonstrate what happens when innovative tactical concepts meet strategic reality. Wingate's long-range penetration theory was sound. Small mobile forces, supplied by air, could operate deep in enemy territory and achieve effects beyond their size. The first operation proved the concept. The second operation expanded it. But expansion changed the nature of operations. Static strongholds replaced mobile columns. Assault missions replaced raids. Endurance contests replaced quick strikes. The Chindits became conventional infantry operating under special forces doctrine in terrain and conditions that defeated both approaches. The soldiers paid for this confusion with casualties that exceeded any comparable operation in the Burma theater. They marched further than any other troops. They fought longer than doctrine allowed. They endured conditions that medical officers warned were unsustainable. When they were finally evacuated in August 1944, most required months of hospitalization. The remainder required shorter treatment before reassignment. None were unchanged. All carried physical and psychological effects for life. This was Wingate's Phantom Army. Not phantoms because they were invisible. Phantoms because they existed in theory more than practice. The theory was brilliant. The practice was brutal. The result was inconclusive. Whether the Chindit operations contributed decisively to victory in Burma remains disputed among historians. Whether the soldiers who served deserved better than they received is not disputed at all.